Well, listen, I was asked to talk about two things, and I'll try and be reasonably brisk on both of them. One, how the media has changed since I started reporting, and I've spent about half my reporting career in newspapers and then the second half in broadcast journalism, so I've seen both sides. And then I'll talk a little bit about interview techniques and so forth, which is really, I guess, why I'm here. When I was at university, I did a lot of politics. I was very much on the left. I was involved in the Labour Party, lots of groups and lots of campaigns of one kind or another, demonstrations and sit-ins and all the rest of it. And I was also involved in student journalism, writing for papers and so forth. And when I finished, I had absolutely no idea what to do. I had no apparent skills of any kind. You know, I had no professional qualification, no professional skills. I'd done English. I could write, but I didn't know anything about anything else. I couldn't speak any other languages. I was innumerate, and so forth. So I thought, okay, I can't really do anything obvious. I better become a journalist. And I applied to lots and lots of places unsuccessfully. And then finally, I applied to the Scotsman newspaper. I'm from Scotland originally, more or less on a whim. And my letter happened to arrive on the editor's desk on the same day that their trainee just vanished off to another job. Their trainee was Lionel Barber, who's now FT editor. But it was just that, only to say that because it was complete serendipity, it was a complete chance. And I wrote lots of letters and I banged on lots of doors, and I just happened to have the right letter at the right moment on the right guy's desk. And I can still remember, in those days, the train up from London to Edinburgh it was overnight, a sleeping train, and there were two people to a cubicle, as it were, on second class. So I can remember going in as a young student into this night sleeper cubicle, and there's a guy sitting there in a string vest and his underpants, smoking, those are the days, with 24 cans of special brew beer on the bed beside him. And I'm going to do a very bad act. He looked up and said, "Hey, I hope you're not one of the English spoofs. Oh, I don't want to smoke, I don't want to drink, I just want to get to me sleep. Oh, you're not one of them bastards." So of course I said, absolutely not, no, not me. As a result of which I drank about 12 cans of super brew and smoked about 600 cigarettes, tumbled out of the station in Edinburgh, Waverley Station, smelling like a kipper, and really quite drunk and dishevelled and bloodshot eyes and unshaven, looking like a total mess. For my interview, stumbled up the stairs of the Scotsman newspaper, which in those days was a wonderful old building just above the station, came into the newsroom and was confronted by about half a dozen men sitting at desks looking much worse than I was. And I thought, I've come home. And so it has proved. When I started political, I came down for other reasons to London after a few years of being a general reporter, doing all sorts of different jobs. And I've been involved in politics and become disillusioned by politics as a something to be directly engaged in, but I was quite interested in reporting it. And the main thing then was, I would say, two or three things about the trade. First of all, I was very rare in having been to university. Most political journalists had not been to university. Most journalists hadn't been to university. Most of my colleagues left school at 16 and had done various trades, and they come in that way. So it was a different kind of profession. It kind of sounded different. It almost smelled different. But secondly, there were far more people engaged in political reporting than there are now. I was on the Scotsman, which was a relatively modest modest circulation newspaper in those days, bigger circulation than it's got now, of course. And our political team had a political editor, a deputy editor, and a gallery reporter who was me. And my job was literally to go to the House of Commons every day and with pretty good shorthand, note down everything that was said in a major debate and everything, however minor, that a Scottish MP said. So I was sitting there for maybe 10 or 12 hours at a time doing shorthand. It was extremely boring, but it gave me a very good, is that me? Yeah. It gave me a very good shorthand, a very good oversight of how the Commons worked, because I would come in the morning about 10:30, choose whichever committee, select committee or bill committee seemed to me to be the most interesting, and sit there for a few hours. Sorry, we don't know who that is. Okay. And sit there for a few hours reporting, writing it down, then rush off at lunchtime, write that up as a story. So you had to spot the story quite quickly. You pick it out, you write it down, and then immediately after lunch, 2:30, straight into the press gallery of the House of Commons and sit there until the Commons rose again, which could be midnight, could be after midnight. And I'd pop out. I'm sorry, this might be my phone. I'm just going to take it out straight away. I don't think it is, but turn it off. Oh, it's a little message telling me that I'm addressing Patchwork. See, that's useful. Right, I'm sorry about that. Normal service resumed. So that's my professional skills, not already. It was a very, very long hours, and I would produce the equivalent of about 3,000 to 5,000 words a day, probably. Not my words, almost literally quotations from MPs with headlines on them. And the Scotsman was really not unusual. We carried a full broadsheet page packed with writing no adverts, no pictures of the House of Commons every single day, and so did the Times, the Telegraph, and the Guardian. Virtually every newspaper carried acres and acres and acres of parliamentary reporting. So, if you got up in the morning and you wanted to know what your MP had said the previous day, or voted, or what had happened in the House of Commons, it was all there for you, for the price of sixpence, whatever it was. That style of reporting has died out almost completely. The Times was the first major newspaper to scrap it. Eventually everybody followed suit. I still regret in many ways that it's gone, because it was the easiest way for ordinary readers to find out what has happened in the House of Commons the previous day, and the House of Lords too. That's the first big change. That kind of reporting has vanished because we have frankly become a more trivial, shopping-orientated society with a shorter attention span. People won't sit and read long reports of what MPs have said. They want scandal, they want big headlines, they want pictures, they want easy stuff. And by and large, now these days, we are in the trade giving them, to our discredit, easy stuff. So that's the first thing. In many ways, the shape of the media was much as it is now. In the early 1980s, we had the same number of national newspapers. The Independent hadn't arrived yet, so it was the same number of national newspapers. Many more journalists working for them because they were much richer. They had much more money coming in from advertising and sales. So far more reporters. But overall, it looked quite the same. And again, in television, you had the big interview programs. You had Brian Walden on a Sunday. Newsnight had just got going. So on the surface, it was pretty similar. Under the surface, it was completely different. There was much more space given to politics. Almost all the newspapers carried much more politics than they do now. The interview programs were much longer. If I do a 22-minute interview, that's a very long interview for me. And even in the BBC, we ask ourselves, are we asking too much of the viewer to have a 22-minute conversation about politics? Well, Brian Walden's interviews were 40 minutes to an hour sometimes, so they were much longer. I think the atmosphere was pretty similar. I don't think there was more deference or less deference. And of course, the biggest issue was that there wasn't the social media and the internet world. And one of the questions I noticed was about ordinary people and politics. And the truth is that when I started off reporting politics in newspapers and then really began at the BBC, we had no idea of what most people thought about what we were reporting, because there's no way for it to come back. You get letters to the newspaper, but very few people bother to write letters to a newspaper, and you don't take them terribly seriously for that reason. So we didn't really have any feedback at all. Now we have a massive amount of feedback. I did an interview with Boris Johnson on Sunday, which was highly controversial, and within 5 minutes my Twitter feed was kind of full of furious people. And we can talk about that later on, but you get instant and very vivid feedback now, and that is the biggest change probably in my lifetime, the way that political journalists operate. Fewer journalists have shorthand, more people rely on electronic recording, but I think that's a relatively trivial difference. The interview styles come and go. There's the old style of being very, very deferential is much mocked. Prime Minister, have you got anything to say to us, to say to the nation today? No. Thank you, Prime Minister. But I think the very, very aggressive interviewing style that followed from that has its problems too. I'm not going to get personal names, but there are people you all know about who developed an extremely aggressive style, not just in asking very angry questions repeatedly, but also in looking as if you were kind of looking down your nose at the interviewee, regarded them as a bit of dirt, didn't take anything they were saying seriously, that kind of thing, which is great, great theatre, and television is of course also theatre. But I take the view that, first of all, I haven't been elected by anybody. They have been elected, and they deserve a certain amount of respect for being elected and being chosen by the people, one way or another. I don't think they're all liars. I don't think they're all villains. But above all, my job is, I'm coming on to the interview side, my job is to get the best out of my interviewee that I can get on that day. I want them to be as interesting, lucid, explaining their world, explaining what they think, coming up with ideas, new thoughts and so forth, as well as I possibly can. Now, some people come on determined not to do that, and you have to keep interrupting, and you have to be quite aggressive and push them. If I think that somebody is simply not telling the truth, and that is becoming apparent, then I think it's legitimate as an interviewer to keep going and keep going and keep going, and be quite aggressive and assertive and almost unpleasant. But very often, your best bet is to look them in the eye, ask reasonably crisp, direct questions that you hope the viewer wants to be answered, and let them speak and let them talk. The best interviews with Margaret Thatcher were the ones where the interviewer said, "Now, Prime Minister, tell us what's on your mind." And by God, she would. It would all come pouring out. And the interviewer would occasionally say, "Really? Tell me more." And you got more out of Margaret. You know, you really want to know what Margaret Thatcher was thinking, then she'd tell you. And that was fascinating. So I think it's a bit like golf. You know, there are different clubs for different occasions. And I'm not suggesting clubbing interviewees, but you know what I mean. So sometimes you do a relatively soft, gentle sounding interview where you actually get much more out of the interviewee than you would if you were being aggressive with them. Sometimes you have to be aggressive, sometimes it's a mix. No interview is ever the same. No interviewee is ever the same. People come in different moods. One of the first things that I have to do as an interviewer is to try to gauge pretty quickly what kind of mood they're in, where they're going, and then there's this sort of psychological interplay with the interviewer goes on the whole time the interview is going on. So I've got in my head a very detailed plan for what I want to get out, where I want to get to, the areas of questioning and so forth. But I have also to be able and prepared to ditch it and go in a different direction if I suddenly think, actually what so-and-so has said about X or Y is really interesting and unexpected, not part of my plan, so I'll follow in that direction. Or if they're getting terribly angry, or they're very upset about a particular line of questioning, am I going too far with it? Do I pull back? Do I change tack? So it's a constant unspoken psychological interplay going on, as well as the on-the-surface questions and answers. So that's, I mean, I approach every interview in the same way, in the sense that I prepare for it very carefully. My editor, Rob, who's now Rob Burley, sits down and I sit down and say, I'll be doing it tomorrow. I've got George Osborne, the Chancellor, and John MacDonald, the Shadow Chancellor, on the show on Sunday. And tomorrow we will sit down and we'll try to work out what are the things where do we think that George Osborne is going to be most interesting, most vulnerable, and we'll look at each aspect of the politics. We'll look at Europe, we'll look at things he said about the budget, we'll look at the U-turns on the budget, and we'll talk about how we can get him to say the most interesting things we can think of. And we'll sort of rehearse it. I mean, Rob will play George Osborne, as it were, and we'll go through it a few times, and we'll think about, well, if he says this, he'll just keep saying X or Y, in which case we have to say Z or P, and so on. We go through it in some detail. So I do that for every big interview. So when I go into an interview, I have in my head maybe sort of 5 or 6 areas. I'm going to go this, and this will then lead into that, and then I'll finally come to the other. So I've got a sort of skeleton of the interview inside my head, and in each part of that skeleton, I know, roughly speaking, the questions that I think are going to be most useful. And within it, like, I've got little quotes or phrases or figures or statistics inside my head. I don't know. And sometimes I will think of an image. So we were trying to talk about the single market with Boris on Sunday, unsuccessfully really. But so the single market is not the same as free trade. And it seems a really, really obscure argument, but it is absolutely at the heart of staying in or leaving the EU. It's completely crucial, and it's very hard to understand. So I was thinking, how do I explain what the single market is? And so I had this image. I come from Dundee, which is in Scotland, which is a big marmalade area. So I said, I've got my pot of marmalade, and I'm trying to sell my marmalade to the Italians. But the Italians said, you know what, there's just slightly too many pips in your marmalade, so we won't buy it. And that's just a protectionist measure so they can sell their Italian marmalade to themselves. And so the EU would intervene on the pips question to ensure that my marmalade, if it was decent marmalade, would be on sale. So I had that image in my head, I'll use the marmalade idea, and so on. So you have all of that, you sit down, and then what you do is the interviewee arrives, and you look across the 2 or 3 feet between the two of you, look them in the eye and think, okay, how is this going to go? And within a few minutes, probably you have been slightly knocked off what you expected. Perhaps the interviewee is much more open and franker than you expected. Sometimes they come on and you have your first trick question, and my goodness, they just answer it properly. You think, wow, this is going to go well. Much more often, you see, he's in a very, very angry or surly mood, or they're very, very nervous. Some very, very often, particularly, I can say, I think with New Labour politicians in the beginning of the coalition years, you had people who had been trained and primed to say absolutely nothing as boringly as possible. And sometimes you get an absolute crash, and it's going to be really, really dreary for everybody, because whatever I say, this person is saying tapioca. How many times have you threatened to resign from the cabinet? Tapioca. How many countries have you visited this year? Tapioca. And so on. I'm exaggerating, but only just. And when you're in that situation, what you have to do is to unbalance them, say something so irritating that they're going to not say tapioca, they're going to say, no, that's absolutely untrue, tapioca. And then you think, okay, well, we're beginning to get somewhere. But every single interview is a kind of dance, and a lot of it is about the mood of the interviewee and my ability to read that as quickly as possible. So just a few early thoughts. I've got lots more I can talk about, but this is a good moment perhaps to ask us some questions, and you can pick me up on what I've said, and we can go into more detail if you like.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marr.
You're very welcome.
Your insight and for the time that you've shared with us. I'm sure all of my fellow patchworkers would agree. We really appreciate this masterclass session with you.
You're more than welcome. Thank you. Yeah.
So now we're going to have our Q&A session. So I'm going to call the first 4 people that would actually have a question they've prepared for you.
Fine.
And then afterwards you would take it in turn to answer these questions. So could we have Nabil, Amira and Adina, as well as Mo, ask their questions?
Hi, Mr. Marr. Thank you for being here.
Delighted to be here.
Yeah. I wanted to cover a topic you just mentioned earlier about how you sort of rehearsed the sort of interviews. And it's really interesting because I was going to ask you about the Prime Minister. How do you prepare for that? And how do you interview him in a way that benefits the audience as well? And how does it differ from any other politician you're interviewing?
All right, well, thanks for that. In reverse order, it doesn't really differ from any other politician, in the sense, if you've got a major politician there, you have to be well prepared, you have to have a plan, and you have to know the kind of things they might say that would be interesting or not. So there's no point in asking about something that isn't a controversy. So with the Prime Minister, the last time I interviewed him, we were talking mainly about Europe, and so, for instance, I thought, well, he's come back from his negotiation. So, although it's been done before, he has these 4 or 5 things that he has negotiated with the EU. Where is the most vulnerable area? Where is it easiest for me to say, you said you were going to get this, but you've only got that? And I went through exactly what he said to the Tory party conference and what he said in his Bloomberg speech, and contrasted it with what he got, and tried to pick holes in it, as it were, as if I was an opposition politician. So I had that. And there were 4 or 5 areas there. I won't go through them all now. And on the day I decided I'm going to go for 2 of them because it's too detailed otherwise. So I'm not going to talk about ever closer union. I'm going to talk about aspects of the benefits deal that he's done. Is it actually deliverable? Could the Department for Work and Pensions, struggling to introduce universal credit, manage this very, very complicated addition to their job? And so I had a few things to ask him about that. And then I wanted to go on to the bigger questions about Europe, because that's fine detail, so you think you have to get bigger than that. And I wanted to try and get him to admit that his original promise of fundamental and irreversible change in the EU had not been delivered. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that it hadn't been delivered. For him to say so would have been a big story if he didn't want to, so we tussled a bit about that. And then I moved to various areas that I thought were going to be really important. And sometimes I got through and got some good stories out of them, and sometimes I didn't. So, for instance, I sat there and I thought, well, if we leave the EU, put myself in the position of we've just voted to leave the EU, what happens next? Well, among the things that happen next is quite a long period of renegotiation and uncertainty. Is it plausible, I ask myself, that the same Prime Minister whose idea the referendum was and who wanted us to vote yes to stay in Europe and has now been rejected by the country would have the authority, the energy, and would actually want to renegotiate post-Brexit relationships with the EU? I find that very, very hard to believe, so I pressed him on that, and he said he would want to stay. I didn't completely convincingly, And then I wanted to talk about Scotland. No one was talking about Scotland, but I'd interviewed Nicola Sturgeon a little while before, and I could remember her very vividly saying, if Britain leaves the EU, that is a trigger for another Scottish referendum. And I know these Scottish opinion polls, because I watch them all the time, and she might very well win that. So you could be out of the EU, Scotland could go. Then what about the Irish situation? We have an open border between the south of Ireland and Northern Ireland, a 310-mile border. If the whole point of this is to keep out migrants from the rest of the EU, you can't do that if you have an open 310-mile border between the UK, part of the UK, and the rest of the EU, which you would have in Ireland. So, a whole series of things I wanted to ask him about. I put them in order in my head. I've tried to work out what I think he's going to say and how I'm going to come back at that. And then I always leave a little bit of time at the end for something personal. He must be absolutely exhausted. What's he going to do next? That kind of thing. So you don't end on a very, very aggressive or detailed policy area. And I plan for that. David Cameron has got this ability to talk at great length, barely drawing breath, but very, very well-formed sentences. So you appear to be really, really rude when you interrupt him. And yet, particularly at the time of the election, he would deliver 6 or 7 minute sentences. Now, in an interview, that means I can get to ask 4 questions, and he gives me 4 mini speeches, which he's prepared ahead of his time, at least mentally, and he's making around the country. It's not really an interview at all. It's a series of party political broadcasts stitched together. So I had to interrupt quite a lot, and he was very angry at the end of that interview. So with David Cameron, it's trying to ensure that the questions are a little bit shorter, we can cover more ground, and that I'm able to, as elegantly as I can, dive in when I don't think he's answering the question or has slid off to something slightly different. That wasn't quite what I was asking about Prime Minister. And you could be very respectful to call him Prime Minister all the time, look him in the eye and smile, but you really have tried to nail him down to something. So it's the same sort of process. And of course the other thing is, if you make him so angry that he's never going to come back on your programme again, then that's a bit of a nose and face cutting off situation. So you have to be a little bit careful about that. But by and large, I treat PM, Jeremy Corbyn, basically all in the same way.
Okay, and the next person, Amira.
Hi, Mr. Marr. My name is Amira. Thank you so much for being here today.
Delighted.
So my question is, your career has required you to both document and broadcast political affairs through the medium of the media. Would you argue that media influences politics, or do both influence upon each other?
Well, thanks for that. I would say that it is impossible to imagine modern politics without the mass media. Our system depends absolutely on us voting in politicians on the basis of party. We have to know who they are, what they're like, and above all, how they behave if they are voted in and they form a government. Now, we can't know those things without the media. Different media are good at different kinds of things. If, on the day after the budget, you are trying to work out whether the Chancellor's changes have made you better off or worse off, then frankly, and I say this as a television person, television is almost completely useless. You want cold black and white print in front of you, you want to go through tables, you want to look at the numbers. If, on the other hand, you want to know what sort of person Peter Mandelson really is, then television is golden. You see the face, you hear the voice, you see him reacting to questions, and it gives you an instant feeling for the kind of people that are ruling us at any one time, which print journalism can never do. So, horses for courses, but it seems to me that modern democratic politics absolutely relies on the media. And the other side of that is that effective politicians are the ones who know that, understand that, and know how to use the media. I always think, my show is watched by 2 million people at the time, and then probably 3 million in the course of the day together. So a lot of people, and they are people, by definition more or less, who are interested in politics, and therefore politicians want to reach. And I'm amazed by the number of politicians who will come on the show, they'll get 20 minutes in front of 2 million people, and they will dodge and weave and manage to say nothing interesting at all, and they come at the end smugly say, well, that happened rather well. That went well. You had a chance to address 2 million people, and you haven't said a single thing that's going to stay in their heads afterwards, not one point, not one new fact that's going to change their minds afterwards. That's a disaster for you. The really good politicians are the ones who come on the show, understand, as it were, the game, and they want to say something that people are going to remember afterwards. It's good for me because people remember they were on the show, and it's good for them because they made a point. So they have good politicians are people who understand the media they're working in. Similarly, some politicians have used Twitter appallingly badly. I won't go into some of the obvious examples, but other politicians use Twitter rather well, use it occasionally and say something refreshing and interesting, which is then spun around the system a lot. So you need to understand about GIFs and Twitter and hashtags and all that now, just as you need to be able to understand about how to conduct a good interview, how to give a good soundbite. The soundbites are very important too. In a news package, there might be a minute of filmed content, and in that minute, the interviewee will probably get 10 seconds or 15 seconds. And if you can make a 10 or 15 second soundbite, you can put a few words together which stick in people's heads, then you're a successful politician in terms of using the media. If you can't, then you don't. People who are unable, we all hate soundbites because they're so trivial and so forth, but by goodness, they sometimes work. Tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, whatever it might be. So there's lots of tricks I think modern politicians have to learn to be effective, but they're all tricks about reaching the voters rather than anything else.
So after Adina, we'll have the questions 3 at a time. So after Adina, it would be Mo, Yolanda, and VJ. So Adina?
Good evening, Mr. Marr. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today. So my question was, what top 3 qualities does one need in order to become a successful political broadcaster or interviewer?
1, you have to be really interested in politics. If you're not interested in politics, and therefore know a lot about politics, it will become quickly obvious and you will be a failure straight away. 2nd, and it may sound rich coming from me after the Boris Johnson interview, you have to listen. Listening is difficult because as an interviewer on television in particular, you will have a microphone in one ear, and my editor and others will be shouting, ask him this, you've only got 3 minutes, there's all sorts of information coming in, and you have to use the other ear. Luckily I've got very big ears, to be very attentive to what your person is saying, because very often the story is buried in a sort of slightly unusual subclause, or where the person pauses. So you have to be listening very, very, very intently, and then be prepared to jump in very quickly with a follow-up question. So I think being really interested in politics, listening hard, and just having, frankly, the brain power to hold in your head a complicated interview structure and follow it, and know how to get out at the end. Plus, you need a certain amount of bedside manner. You don't want everything to be aggressive. You want, particularly on a Sunday morning, you want it to be reasonably genial where it can be. So you have a good sense of timing, real interest in politics, and hard listening and fast responses. It's not very difficult. It's more difficult than learning to ride a bicycle, I would say. It's much less difficult than learning to play the piano. That's where I put it.
Hi Andrew. My name is Mo, and again, thanks a lot for your time today and spending your time with us. My question, I guess you've answered it a bit, so I'm going to reword it slightly. A lot has changed with how you interact with everyday people, I guess. So how do you find the balance between getting people interested in politics but not putting on a show? How do you engage people when people seem to be engaged by the lack of trumps or theater, basically?
Well, you accept that, television is a bastard medium in the sense that it is not simply an informative medium, it's also an entertainment and theatrical medium. My view is that if you can convince people at the start of the show that the issue is really important, whether it's the junior doctors strike in the way that the government's treating them, and that you have got the person of the moment, and we have Jeremy Hunt here today to answer all those criticisms which have been building up, then a lot of people are going to be. So that is in a sense theatrical. Here's a big issue, here's the person, here's the moment. And then I think I spend a lot of time trying to take quite complicated things and simplify them down to a point where I can make questions that are understandable to the viewer and make sense and don't caricature the issue concerned and don't underplay the issue concerned. So a lot of it is about the sheer intellectual business of boiling down complicated things into something that everyone's going to understand and engage in. And that's about using metaphors, using similes, using humour. All of those things are important. A famous American editor once said, editors are people who separate the wheat from the chaff and then print the chaff. And our job is to make sure that doesn't happen in our programmes. That's help.
Hi, I'm Yolanda. I'd like to again thank you so much for being here. Truly appreciate it. So, as being a journalist and broadcaster for the past 25 years, I wanted to ask, what are the major changes you feel you've witnessed in politics, and how effective this has been, and how has it impacted on what you do?
Well, I think the biggest single change has been very quickly rising public mistrust and even loathing of the elites and the political class, which may have always been there, but to journalists and those involved in reporting politics, it was not nearly so obvious before social media. I think the way that journalists and politicians interact hasn't changed very much. When I was a young reporter looking at the great columnists of the day, they spent a lot more time socialising with the leading politicians. Peter Jenkins, who was the great columnist on the Independent when I started, was always having sort of country weekends with members of the cabinet or the leaders of the opposition parties, and his advice was sought, and he was part of the game. And then people became, I think, either bored or cynical about journalists who got too close to politicians, they thought. And that it was always a very difficult relationship, because you had to get close to, and you do have to get close to politicians if you want to know what they're thinking and what they're really thinking and what's likely to happen next, and therefore get stories. You have to get close to them. But then you have to be cold-hearted enough to betray that friendship, if that's what it becomes, when the time is right. I had a very close friendship with John Patton, the Education Secretary in the Thatcher years. He was a great source for me as to what was happening in Margaret Thatcher's government. And then he became Education Secretary, and he really wasn't a very successful Education Secretary. And I wrote a withering column about how poor he was. And he was terribly upset. We've had lunch together many, many times, and now you write this about me. And the answer is, I'm a journalist. That's my job, So it's never easy. I think probably today's political journalists are a little bit more removed from today's politicians than was the case when I started, but only a bit. And I think journalists, all of us, are ruder and more abrasive to and about politicians, and that makes me slightly uneasy, because we feel that the public are angrier, and therefore we're trying to channel public anger and express it more. But actually, again, I come back to, nobody elected us. Who are we to be so hoity-toity and so grand, and try and pull down these people who have stood for election and work day and night to get the public's trust? So I'm uneasy about that. I'm quoting Americans a lot now, but there was a great American columnist who I think very well defined the bigger change. He said, in the old days, he said, we used to dine with politicians, and then we'd find ourselves hanging around outside their gates when they dined and shout questions as they left, and now we dine on them. And I think that's quite a good way of thinking about the change.
Good evening, Mr. Marr. Thank you again for being here today. My name is Vijay, and I would like to ask you, what top 3 interviewing skills would you advise for both an interviewer and an interviewee?
Well, in a sense, I suppose I've talked about the interviewer, and I would just go back to listening, being very well prepared, and having the psychological subtlety to be able to pick up quite quickly what your interviewee is saying and what mood they're in and what you're best going to get out of them. I would say for an interviewee, the first thing to do is to learn to speak in reasonably clear English, to know what you want to say and say it, and don't treat an interview as an opportunity to make another little party political speech. Listen to the questions and treat the audience seriously. You may dislike the interviewer, you may think the programme's not up to much, you may be cross, but remember that 500,000, 2 million, 3 million people are watching you, and they're your voters, and they deserve as clear and straightforward answers as you can give them. If you can use a bit of humour, so much the better, but try and give a reasonably straight answer to a reasonably straight question. It's much better to say, do you know what, Andrew? I'm not able to tell you that. I'm going to give that information to the House of Commons first, but I can't tell you that today, than to sort of dodge around and obfuscate. which will be spotted very quickly by the public watching. I mean, very often, you know, I will ask a sort of perhaps impossible question. So I'll say to the Prime Minister, if you lose the Brexit vote, will you resign as Prime Minister? And he doesn't assume, for the sake of argument, he doesn't want to say yes or no. Actually, at the moment, he's saying, no, I won't resign, but assume for the sake, then, and he might say, the most important thing, Andrew, about the Brexit vote is da da da. I think, yeah, but that's not what I asked you. The most important thing about the Brexit vote is that looks terrible, comes across very, very badly. So if you're an interviewee, if you're a politician, try to avoid doing that. Try to be upfront when you're not going to answer the question. Say, I'm not going to tell you the answer to that just now for these reasons, and then move on. And you know, frankly, voters are very forgiving of that. They understand that not every politician can answer every question at the time it's asked for all sorts of reasons. But say so. Say what you're doing. Don't try and pretend you are answering when you're not. Don't answer a completely different question. You just look stupid.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marr. We're going to have our next three people, who are Courtney, Tabassum and Laura.
Hi, thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Courtney Smith. Thank you for the thought-provoking masterclass today. You've kind of come across, talked about kind of techniques already, so like maybe like skeletons and kind of research. But do you have any further kind of interview techniques that you'd have in terms of getting honest and direct answers from political figures? And if they don't work, do you have any alternatives?
Well, something I didn't used to do. I've got is use quotes and direct quotes in front of me. I don't like having an interview plan. I don't like sitting there with a list of questions like that, because when I'm reading my questions, I'm not making eye contact, and I prefer to make eye contact more or less the whole time, because it's a psychological thing, a conversation. And if you're looking away, it's disconcerting for the interviewer, and the interviewee actually. And it breaks the eye contact, it breaks the rhythm. So I, by and large, try not to have a piece of paper in my hand. However, I have found recently, I found with Boris Johnson, for instance, when he said, you know, I've never been, you know, my economic advisor hasn't been, you know, he's pro-Brexit or whatever. I had the quote that he'd said there. I said, well, here's what he said yesterday, and I can read it to him, and that is quite effective. And very occasionally, okay, well, let's just remind you what the Prime Minister said, and you'll turn around on a bit of video. So when politicians are saying that red is blue or green is yellow, and you're able to show them that actually no, yellow is yellow, and here's the proof of it, here's the quote, here's the clip. That's quite useful, so I do that. Beyond that, no, not terribly. I mean, the worst possible thing is to go into an interview badly prepared. You are completely scuppered. If someone gives you a fact and you don't check it out properly, and you're wrong, you can be completely wrong-footed. And I have been badly wrong-footed by not preparing, doing that extra core phone call, an extra piece of research. And I'll give you two examples, because they were both embarrassing. I did a notorious interview with Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister. Now, the background was that I'd been told by a lot of people working with him in Cabinet and civil servants about his appalling temper tantrums and rages, including one time where he threw an entire tea service of coffee cups, coffee, tea, milk, biscuits across the room, shattering china, because he was in a rage. And there was a lot of gossip at the time, Lib Dems were talking about, that he was taking up pills to calm him down. And it was on the internet as well, and I picked this up from a newspaper, and someone said no one will ever ask, of course, if he's taking pills. And I just read a book by David Owen, the former Foreign Secretary, SDP founder, in which he'd said, in Britain, we deserve to know a lot more about the health and the mental state of our leaders. The Americans accept that. All the doctors' reports of American presidents are made public and so forth. We have a very odd privacy culture here. And so I said to him something along the lines of, you've been very, very angry as Prime Minister from time to time. You get very depressed, I think. Lots of people in this country use pills to help get them through. Are you one of them? And he took huge offence at that, and it became a massive, massive story. I was all over the front page of the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and so forth, as the most disreputable journalist in Britain, going into areas that should be left private. Now, it's a legitimate area of questioning, because I knew about the task. I would have been so much better if I had said, Prime Minister, you've had some appalling temper tantrums, you've thrown things around the office, you've really offended some of your colleagues. Are you losing it a bit? Because he couldn't have denied that. But by putting it that way and not taking a little bit more thought, I shot myself in the foot In the same interview, for the very first time, Gordon Brown had admitted that he had not properly regulated the banks before the crisis. And I thought that's a much, much bigger story. But he got completely overwhelmed by the pills question. And there's a second example. Like, yes, another example with David Cameron. So I was embarrassed by that. It was a bad moment for me, and I ought to have thought about it more before I did it. There was another moment when I was told that David Cameron had told the Countryside Alliance that, quotes, "Fox hunting is my sport, which I love." And in the last interview I did with him before the general election, I put that quote to him. He looked completely startled. I said, "What's your favourite sport, Prime Minister?" He said, "Oh, football." No, that's always a safe thing to say. I said, "Well, it's funny, because you told the Countryside Alliance fox hunting is my favourite sport, which I love." And he looked really cross, really upset, really angry. Anyway, it turned out he hadn't said that at all. It was the reporter who had said that, and it was a garbled report in a local newspaper, and I was wrong, and I was wrong-footed. So always do the research, always do the research. When you think you're absolutely certain you've got it right, check one more time.
We've got about 10 minutes left. If I can have the chair's permission. Obviously, you are one of the leading people in terms of doing interviews. How do you then recover from a bad interview? So all of us here have bad experiences. Sometimes we make errors in our places of work or our studies. How do you actually go back and readdress to make sure that you don't make that error again?
Kick the furniture. Sit there, read the worst things that are said about you on Twitter and elsewhere. If someone gives you a real bad review, as it were, in the papers, don't just shout at them mentally about it. You know, sit there, read it, accept that you may have got it wrong. That's the main thing. Is you must not assume that you were right and everybody else was wrong. If they think you were wrong, you were probably wrong. So you just have to swallow. You have to, eat the shit, frankly.
Great advice. Great.
Thank you. So the next person we have is Tabasum, and then we have Laura, and I think after that, perhaps that would be the last question.
Hello, Mr. Marr. I'm Tabasum. Thank you for your time once again. My question is, what was your most memorable interview and why?
The most memorable interview, it's always the last one, really. I was very pleased that I did an interview with George Osborne before the election, where I think I demonstrated that the £9 billion they had found for the NHS didn't come from anywhere in particular. It was down the back of the sofa, there was no particular reason, it wasn't going to raise taxes to fund it, etc. And that was important because it suggested that this iron discipline, we have to cut the social security budget by X and so forth, the whole thing was a little bit dodgy. So I was pleased with that. There was a lot of research went into that, and I think it moved the argument on at that time. At the moment, the most memorable interview is the last one I did with Boris Johnson, and I slightly misread that one. I should say on the record, I'm an admirer. I think he's a very bright, cultured, sophisticated, funny, intelligent man. If also the most ambitious politician I've ever met. And I was looking forward to a really good exchange of views, and I wanted to really get under the skin of what he thought about the future of Britain after Brexit, what he really thought about the number of trade deals that we'd have to renegotiate, what he thought about the threats from some of the big city banks that they would leave for Frankfurt or Paris if we left the EU. And he had come in a mode to really say what he wanted to say. He had a series of things he wanted to say, and he was not going to be deflected. He was going to talk at length over me. And at that point, I had a very straightforward choice. I either lie down on the floor and let Boris jump up and down on me, or I did what I did, which is I interrupted him quite a lot. Now, the reason I didn't like that as an interview was that it was scratchy and I think quite difficult to watch, where two people are talking over each other and it's quite aggressive. I think it's hard for the viewer. But I don't think in retrospect I could have done anything else. I wasn't quick enough maybe when he came in to work out what he was doing and to think of a very clever way of knocking him off course without interrupting him. So it did become a bit shouty, a bit interrupting, and I wasn't very happy with that. As I say, if I had been a sharper, cleverer, more experienced interviewer, maybe I would have found a way of kind of turning the bulldozer slightly to one side rather than heckling it. But that's the most memorable one in a bad way at the moment.
So just, I think one of the last questions, as an avid historian, who is one of the people you most like to interview that is alive today, and who would that be like?
An obvious and boring answer would be Churchill, because there's so much that he said that you'd like to go back and ask him. Things like when he was campaigning against nuclear weapons right at the beginning, what was he really frightened about? Was he really worried about the Americans? I just love to know what he really thought of Stalin, because they sat opposite each other for such a long time. I'd love to know what he really... People still today, they debate what he really meant when he said we want the United States of Europe. He clearly didn't want Britain to be part of it, but if he had been around now, would he have thought the United States of Europe was a good thing or a bad thing? And would he have wanted us to be part of it now? There's all sorts of things you'd like to ask him about. And then there's all my personal heroes, with people like Tolstoy and Matisse, but that's away from politics. But yeah, I think probably Churchill of all the people. I just missed interviewing Margaret Thatcher. I asked her questions at press conferences, but I was just too young and junior to actually do a full interview with her. I'd love to have tried that.